So we've started the recording, welcoming everybody to this exploration of the 2020 Aries Ingress for the USA. So I just want to say welcome and thank you to Lehman, who's going to be guiding us through the material. We've got a lot here. I think I counted something like somewhere between 9 to 11 charts that we've got to explore. I'm going to be paying attention to the chat box to make sure that if there are questions, I am, bringing these forward for the group to discuss. So Lee, don't feel like you need to keep an eye on the chat box. I can
Thanks.
monitor that for us.
It's always hard to do both.
Yeah, it's really tough.
And if we start getting into something, wait, I'll go over and check it for you.
Okay, great. And then, yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks, Lee. And what we're going to do is we're going to try and take this mostly chronological because there's, I think the point that Lee and I feel quite strongly about is that there's no moment in time, that is singular or exists in a vacuum. We are experiencing astrology in the midst of cycles that are wider and observing cycles that are lower happening at the same time. And the tradition is quite clear that to be able to get a decent, strong, and good interpretation, a fluent interpretation of what's going on, what you need is some understanding of the cycles that are currently in play. So we'll go ahead and start this presentation with the 2019 solar eclipse at 4 degrees of Capricorn. Lee, do you want to kick off some thoughts on this?
Sure. Well, where I basically want to start is this, or where I would start with this material is this. I'm sure a number of you attended the kind of beginning of 2020 prediction videos that were around. OPA had one. There were other places that had people talking about this, and people have been talking about 2020 in a somewhat different format than has been typical. I mean, pretty much every local astrology group, the last meeting in December is to talk about the following year. But there were a lot of reasons to talk about 2020 beyond that. And so I'd kind of like to put you in a context and then start with this as the lead chart for the year. The context is basically this, and in my own material, I had spelled this out in my book, Astrology of Sustainability, which is really my mundane book, back in 2010. And what I had noticed going into the 20 teens, and really from the period of 2008, was that there are a whole series of mundane charts that astrologers work with. Typically, there are 2 or more eclipse charts per year. Those we work with, and here you see we're starting with that. There are the Cardinal Ingress series, where you work with 1 to 4 of them, depending on depending on the nature of the year. And then pretty much all the other charts run according to their synodic cycles. And the interesting thing about the 20 teens was the complete absence of any sort of major conjunction that wasn't almost necessary to happen in the decade. And we'll see as we go through this that in fact what happened this year is we got more than the usual amount after a period of having none of them. Basically what this meant, and this is what I had talked about in sustainability, was that because basically a conjunction is, among other things, a time of coming together and the start of a new cycle. When all of your cycles are old, and when the aspects that you're getting are things like oppositions and squares, you get people who get angry at each other. And so it was obvious to me going into the 22 teens that we were basically going to be having the same discussions in 2020 that we were having in 2010, because nothing was going to get resolved. And there was going to be a lot more layers of anger on top of it, because you had the charts indicating discord, but you didn't have anything that represented a kind of a coming together or resolution or new take. So here we are at the 2019 solar eclipse, going into a period where suddenly you've got the potential for a lot of resolution, but on a mundane level, resolution isn't always fun and glorious. So here, of course, you see the sun. When you're looking at an eclipse, of course, the big thing is where's the eclipse? And what you see about this eclipse is you've got the sun and the moon together with Jupiter very tight. Of course, the node is tight because it wouldn't be an eclipse if the node weren't tight. So we don't have to add that piece. So you've got that whole configuration in the US right at the IC. And since Wade and I both follow the Lily tradition, we would call that angular because it's within 5 degrees of the angular cusp. So a very angular at the fourth house. So the fourth house, when you're looking mundane, is the land, it's the country, it's and when you look at a whole series of mundane charts, what you'll see is when you have a lot of activity at the fourth, it is a challenge to the land. It is a challenge to, and in the sense that the land is the country, that the place is the country. This can be a very severe challenge. You saw that kind of challenge, for example, with the U.S. Dust Bowl in the 1930s. That you could see this and say, "Wow, life is going to be different after a year like this." The presence of Jupiter with the eclipse. Now you don't just have the sun and the moon; you have another body. You have Jupiter there, and Jupiter is in the sign of its fall. So this Jupiter is not a normal, happy, boisterous Jupiter. It's square the ascendant. The people are going to be pissed. So there's already implied in this a level of discord. And then, of course, you can also look and see what is Jupiter ruling? Well, Jupiter's ruling the sixth, which among other things includes disease, but probably at the point that most people were looking at this, they weren't thinking about the disease end. They might have been thinking about labor. They might have been thinking about the healthcare industry. But you could certainly see at this point with Neptune sitting there that there was something that was unknown, mysterious, and probably not very well figured in. And of course, if you look at some of the more modern medical material, some of the 20th century people have ascribed to Neptune immunity, which is certainly a concept you can't directly get out of the classical sources. So we can leave that. So you've got a lot of activity. So Wade, pick up.
Yeah, I think that the eclipse here, when we take a look at this particular one in Capricorn, one of the things that really strike me is, I've been doing a lot of research into labor and labor practices, and I think beyond just taking, and this is probably going to kick more into the Aries Ingress chart itself, so maybe I'll hold some of these comments out. But the focus of so many planets in Capricorn, it's not that I associate Capricorn with work. I want to be clear about that. The association that I make with Capricorn is it's the type of labor where there is constant activity that requires, and this idea of constant activity is coming from Capricorn being a cardinal sign. This is an earth sign, so we're also talking about things that have physical assets and physical basis. So this is work that requires the physical body to be present and to be active and coordinated with the surrounding space. If that seems a little confusing, consider that a lot of jobs right now are done remotely. They are done with data. They're done through technology that requires you to not actually have to engage in a physical asset. Of course, that's not the case for people like baristas. It's not the case for manufacturers. It's not the case for shippers or people who work in logistics. I mean, these people actually have to physically touch and move and be a part of things. The emphasis of the sixth house, in Pisces, the cusp being in Pisces with the ruler of that sign on the cusp of the fourth, it kind of indicates this, and I don't think that we can also, disregard the fact that all of those planets down there, Lee, they're dark, aren't they?
Yeah.
It's not just that the fourth house is a dark house. Everything that's happening under the horizon here is so close to the sun to essentially not be visible. The only planet that we've got above the horizon right now is Uranus, but the real focus for me in this chart is a combination of both the moon and Jupiter in the fourth house that are made dark by their conjunction to the sun. And this emphasis on the people and relationship to labor and the difficulty that's happened that has been right in front of us, but we've been choosing not to see, not to experience, not to witness, and to ignore. We'll get to this as we move forward, but I think about the $1,200 stimulus check that's been sent out for the American people to hopefully to weather some of these difficult times. But the recognition is, nobody can live on that. It doesn't matter where you are, you can't live on that amount. And I think we're getting, this is something that Alicia had said in the Australian conversation. I think she's spot on to point that, that brings an awareness of the kind of conditions we've been asking people to live in and saying, kind of pull up your bootstraps and just, get on with it. Well, while we're watching the economy slide, an increase in joblessness, I mean, we can see, the tension here, as the mapping of inequality really starts to be quite striking.
Now, there's another point here that we can make, which I think is a good contextual piece, because we brought this chart in as a context in which to then slip into 2020. William Lilly, in his book Anastenobrosis, The Dark Year, talked about a concept that he referred to as the masteries or overpowering of the elements. And what this idea represented is that if you have a really high count of a particular element, that all the qualities of that element will overpower the chart. That's the idea of the overpowering piece. Well, here, and you'll be seeing through the next few charts, and what we're in right now, is a period where you've got this really heavy Capricorn. We were seeing that last year to a degree, as the whole mess of conjunctions going Saturn Pluto was occurring. When you have an overmastering of elements, all of the issues of that element start to come into the conversation. Now here, literally, it's at the nadir. It's at this darkest point in an already dark element.
That's right. Yeah, and of course, taking a look at this, we also have all planets in, the feminine quality signs, with the exception of Mercury and Venus. But this is something that's been interesting to watch, as all the superior planets have, Jupiter and Saturn, Pluto, Uranus, and Neptune, all of these, these heavier planets being together in water and earth signs, and what that says about the larger social movements that we've been seeing, which I think is quite interesting. Should we move forward, Lee?
Yeah, let's go.
I did have one question from somebody that I wanted to address actually before we do. The question that we received is, should we look at Neptune potentially as an indicator of socialism? And I think that Lee had kind of made this point a little bit about this idea of, unifying, maybe a unifying principle behind Neptune. I don't know if I would personally jump to Neptune as an indicator of socialism. I think when we think about the principles of socialism, I think we need to, kind of step back and ask, what version and form of socialism are we talking about? Like, rather than saying there's one significator for an entire system, take a look at what pieces of the system make sense. So if we're talking about workers owning means of production, I think that's a really difficult thing to probably put to a planet. That's probably more about the relationship planets have to their own sign, if that makes sense. So, being one's own dispositor, for instance, might be a better indicator for something like socialism. So, as I start to see planets that, in mundane charts where they enter into their own sign, conversations like socialism and an embracing of principles about, ownership of means of production are probably more likely to enter into the equation. Now, whether or not that's actually the solution to the problems that we have, I have serious doubts, and it's not because I don't like socialism. I don't personally care what system we have as long as it works for the bulk of as many people as possible. But I think that there's a larger conversation that we need to be having that we're not having about the behaviors and choices we make. I think that it's too easy for us to say if we just had a different system, humans would be better. And I'm not. Maybe I'm just a pessimist, but I don't really think that that there's any evidence in any period in history that points in that direction for us. And I'm working right now on developing a couple articles that kind of speak to this idea of change of system, either within one culture or as systems move and migrate across cultures, political systems and economic systems, which we need to separate, but sometimes they do have overlap. Has human behavior actually changed? And do we see that, we move in a different direction? I gave a talk recently about labor and how COVID, I thought, was going to make an impact on the future of labor. One of the points that I made was that there was a diagram that is very common for people to recognize as the Pyramid of Capitalism, but that actually started as a critique of an empire that existed in Russia, and then it was further developed to then critique the same kind of plutocratic thing that we see happening in many of the state welfare socialist nations that exist today. So in the end, I mean, I think that the real question we have is, what is our relationship to power? And until we understand our relationship to power, we're going to continue to confuse the method of power with the relationship to power itself. So capitalist systems, wealth is a pretty big, and profit is the big, you know, power vehicle, and that's, I think, where a lot of our attention goes. But I think the question is bigger than that. We do have a
Could I also quickly talk to
please.
Mark's question?
I was just about to read that. Yeah.
Yep. Right on the same page again, Wade.
Yeah.
So yes, it's true that Ptolemy started the tradition of working primarily with visible eclipses.
Hey, Lee, could we, just for the recording, can we say what the question is?
Yes, the question is, a question on eclipse charts. Didn't traditional authors consider eclipses below the horizon, i.e. where the eclipse path was nowhere near their location, as less significant to that country? And I believe this comes from Talley, who discusses visible eclipses. Most of the authors up to Marinus tended to favor that. Personally, I've worked with them both ways. You may know that the program Solar Maps gives you the ability to see the eclipse path on the astrological astrocartography type projections. Theoretically, I would say, if you're talking about the sun's eclipse, for example, here, you can't see it when it's at midnight, certainly. But I would not be one to say that it cannot have an effect.
I would, I was probably one of the people that was in my mid 20s really championing that point of view myself, and it was coming from, somebody much cleverer than me said it, and so I'm going to repeat it, and I'm going to say that this is the way that it is. And I have come to change my point of view on that. One, through it being evidenced by my colleagues, peers, other astrologers across the world have seen some pretty impressive things done with eclipses that are not visible. But I think what I've just realized, if I just, kind of step back from the point of view that, you're right, Mark, it was Ptolemy who mentioned this, and it was repeated, from anybody who considered Ptolemy worth repeating. I think the point is that we need to add that to the interpretation.
Yes.
It's not that we delete that eclipse from occurring. I think it's one of those things where we say, we're not going to exactly witness and experience and see the ways in which the tectonic shades are the plates are shifting, but we recognize that they are. We recognize that there is unrest, and it's kind of like that. I don't want to, that joke, chaos theory, right? Butterfly one side of the world, tsunami on the other. I don't necessarily want to say it's that extreme, but you don't necessarily have to, especially the more globalized we become, the more interconnected the world is. You don't really need to have such a huge forcible impact, which I think is what you get when the eclipse is visible from above the horizon. You get that really jarring, visible, clear effect. Underneath, it seems to be a little bit more internalized. And so there is a difference in reaction. And of course, if you there's a difference in reaction, there's a difference in processing. But I don't think you need to have that really jarring experience to be able to see the impact if you can zoom out far enough. But anyway, that's just a point of view that I've got now. Why don't we move forward, jump into the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, and whew, what a chart. Why don't you, maybe if you want to start us off, Lee?
Oh, okay. I think one of the things, first of all, our modern astrology colleagues really focused in on this because, Saturn Pluto was Saturn Pluto, right? So what happened with this? Well, the first thing you notice is this taking, now, again, we're talking here in the location of the United States, just as, in a sense, the fact that that eclipse was right at our midnight meant that perhaps we weren't the locus of the changes that were happening, although they definitely will have an impact in the U.S. further down the road. Mm. Here, it's right up at the 10th. Mm-hmm. So what do we have? Well, we have, of course, this was immediately during the time period where Trump decided to take out a general from a party he considered to be, to be inimical to the United States. So there you have Sun, Saturn, Pluto right up at the 10th house, and with the Saturn ruling it. So we certainly had a sudden, unexpected, violent event, which then appeared to pass. Now, I think most of us by now have virtually forgotten that,
Mm.
because a few other things have happened in the meantime. Um, the Uranus rising in the chart certainly says that there's going to be a rather sudden and unexpected change in consciousness, as we could say, to use some of the more modern terms about this. Oi. Um, what was of more concern when I had looked at this chart was that clearly this represents major challenge to any kind of authority figure, whether it's a president, whether it's a governor, anyone who's in a position of 10th house authority type. The presence of Mars at the 8th house in a chart is never something you look forward to in a mundane capacity, because
That's right.
the
Yeah.
8th house, of course, is death. Um, by this time, Jupiter was at this time Jupiter was not with the mess, as I had been calling them all last year, but it was with the South Node. And here you have Jupiter ruling the 8th house, and it's in the sign of its detriment. Well, that doesn't mean you get less deaths, and you have it in conjunction to a major malefic, because the South Node in Western astrology has represented a destruction kind of energy. And so this was and continues to be a very dangerous chart.
Mm.
The only thing it had going for it is that we didn't get a triple conjunction this year.
Yeah, that nearness of the sun made that not happen, which is
Yeah, exactly.
which is nice. We get to move past that. I think, one of the things that stand out to me in this chart is that 22 of Earth signs. That connects back to the May 2000 Saturn Jupiter conjunction at 22 degrees of Taurus, which is actually on Trump's midheaven as well. So I think seeing this gathering of planets 21 to 23 of Capricorn right there on the midheaven, it seems to be this kind of culminating signature of the last 20 years of wealth and income inequality moving in two completely different directions. And I mean, at least this is the position that I'm taking right now, but and that somebody like Trump would be reigning over the last period of this within this Saturn-Jupiter series. So we're obviously about to come to the end of the Saturn-Jupiter conjunctions in the Earth signs. From 2000 through 2020, that conjunction was happening in Taurus, and then we'll move into Aquarius, which we'll hit on at the end of this presentation today. And so there's some huge reverberations that are going to be felt from this moment. I think one of the things that I was at the FAA conference in Australia this past January, and I made a joke with Lynn Bell, because we've been talking about Saturn Pluto for so long that, this was on 12th of January, that conference was a week later. So when the conference started, I was like, I am so over talking about Saturn Pluto. It's done. It's behind. It's over. It's like it's in the past now. We can move on. But of course, it doesn't really work that way. And I think this chart is going to be a very important one for astrologers to pay attention to for some time. It's one of those kind of things I've been, kind of playing in my head about, like, how can I quite explain? Because I think this idea of, I am a pretty no-nonsense, very practical kind of person. I don't love talking about ethereal, very intangible ideas. So it's tough for me when somebody starts talking about things like collective consciousness, or they start talking about, the human evolution of consciousness, things like this. Because it just feels too difficult for me to understand and to grasp, and it feels like it's making assumptions about beliefs that maybe I don't share. But one of the things that I think helped me kind of make sense of this is the idea that there is, and thinking about generational trauma too has kind of come into some thinking that I've had. It's kind of like you've got a couple hundred people on a boat, and some of them are looking one direction, everyone else looking in different directions, and a huge meteor falls from the sky right in the middle of the ocean. And what happens there? Well, we're going to have huge waves, that send out is a very violent moment, and it's going to impact and affect everybody. And you may not have been looking in that direction. You may not have been paying attention. You may not have seen it. It had nothing to do with you or your experience, but you are still going to be experiencing the shock waves for a very long time. That the ripples from something like that don't settle right away. And I think the continual resurgence of these 22 degrees of earth signs, and the emphasis at a degree like that we had from the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction in 2000, and then now this Saturn-Pluto happening in 2020. This is, to me, what it feels like to hit another wave of some rather uncomfortable, violent moments that have happened in the past. And so this is, I think, what it looks like when we're experiencing and paying attention to this kind of difficult periods that are jumping through collective consciousness. We're seeing it, we're experiencing it. At any rate, I don't know. I just kind of wanted to talk about that at some stage.
This represents a 30+ year cycle. And being one of the cycles involving Pluto, you can't give an exact date, because with Pluto's orbit being so elongated compared to the more inner planets, there is quite a year range in terms of how much that can be. Most Saturn-Pluto times are pretty traumatic. Occasionally one passes where it's not a year that you would have remembered, but rarely is that so.
Right. Is there anything else you want to pick up on Saturn-Pluto?
No, let's go on, Wade. We've got plenty of charts.
We sure do. All right, here we go. 2020 Aries Ingress. Now, one of the things that I'll kick it over to you in just a second, Lee, but I just want to point out, that we've got fixed signs on the angles here. I think for those who will have studied the tradition will recognize that there is an aphorism that if you've got fixed signs on angles, then that chart holds for the whole year. If you've got cardinal signs, then that holds until the next cardinal ingress. Or if it's a mutable sign, it will hold until the Libra ingress. So the idea is that fixed signs at the Aries ingress on the ascendant will point to and indicate a year where the symbolism is quite stable. And the mutable signs, sorry, the cardinal signs indicate a lot of change. So remember that Aries, Cancer, Capricorn, Libra, they usher in new seasons. They indicate lots of change. And so having one of those signs on the ascendant would usually indicate that the symbolism isn't quite as lasting, and we would want to continually look at the next ingress charts. And then the mutable signs will be somewhere in between. I think largely what's probably easy for us to accept and to recognize is that the Aries ingress will hold all year long anyway. It's kind of like a yes and conversation where we'll have the Aries ingress, but then the question of whether or not how the other ingresses kind of feed into this, and whether they're, kind of stepping forward with equal footing, or if they are, the Aries ingress will stand, above all of them, is, that's a discussion for another time. But in my mind, even if this had been a cardinal sign, I would have felt quite confident looking at the Aries ingress, and again, building that into my interpretation, where the symbolism will probably carry out all year long, but the way that it does it will continue to shift and change and adapt and evolve. Lee, do you want to kick us off some thoughts you've got on this chart?
Well, I had mentioned with respect to the Capricorn, the Capricorn eclipse, that we were in this period of the overmastering of the elements. So by this time of the Aries ingress, this is starting to break up somewhat. Now we don't have as much of the emphasis on Capricorn, because of course the sun has moved on and taken his inferiors with him. Right. Although of course Venus is also in an earth sign. So we still have, and the modern people would say, oh, well, this is wedge chart. Now, when I look at patterns in a more traditional way, of course, I'm not looking at the outers on that. But there's still here, I would also almost call the overmastering not of the elements, but still of the symbolism, because certainly as the moon here is in Aquarius, that doesn't relieve the Saturnian sense of it. So big emphasis here on economic considerations. Now, of course, what's been interesting for the last 5 or 6 years, on, on the street, as people would have said. There's been a lot of discussion of when is the economic downturn going to be.
Hmm.
Um, and certainly here, when you see you see Mars, Jupiter, Pluto, all in Capricorn, all associated with the second house with the South Node there. It's a complete no-brainer to say that this is a period of time which is not good economically.
Right. Yeah.
But what you then have to do is say, okay, well, what's wrong? Okay, because there is a matter of rationality here, especially in a market situation where so much of the trading is basically bots. Um, so what we can see here is, again, you go to the sixth house. Is it labor? Is it illness? Um, as far as trying to distinguish between the two of them, if you go into the work of Ibn Ezra, if you go into the work of Mashallah, the first triplicity ruler of the sixth house cusp would represent the disease issues. The second triplicity ruler would represent servitude and slavery, and it's kind of there that we get to the issue of why there's a sixth house connection
Hmm.
to these matters. But certainly, there's a Uranus factor here, which is kind of like the curveball. Well, and this is as good a time as any to say how much of the pandemic really is a curveball. To which I would say, well, practically none of it actually,
Right.
um, because there've been a lot of indicators that this is coming. One of the associations with the air element in the past has been plagues. And we know that when the Black Death took Europe and the Pope asked the Sorbonne for what was the reason why, we've just lost half our population, John of Essendon said, well, it was because of the major conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn with Mars in Aquarius. Um, there, several years ago, I had a student of mine who had looked at this question of plagues, and she was actually comparing this period of 2020 and 2021 to the 1918 flu epidemic, and on that basis, about 3 years ago, said 2020 to 2021 looks as bad or worse than 1918. So, these were basically things that if you were looking at them as historical cycles, this was clearly something. Now, whether without looking at charts like this, you would say, and it'll also crash your economy. I mean, it's kind of on the one hand, it's a logical outcome. On the other hand, you look at it and say, well, the astrology certainly supports that. Again, I think much as when we were looking at the idea of the solar eclipse being at midnight, this is telling you, among other things, no matter how strong the effect ends up being here, it didn't so much originate here when we're in a global context.
Hmm.
So, again, everything's below the horizon. This
Yes. Yeah.
happened here, but it's not necessarily instigating here during this period of time.
Yeah, I think the absence of anything above the horizon, the kind of thought that I've had on that is, and it's kind of like a vacuum of leadership. There's no guiding light here. And I think if we take a look at the way that U.S. leaders have approached the current economic crisis that we have, the testing crisis, the hospital crisis, what we're seeing is that because nobody who really should be stepping forward in those kind of, like the people who are actually charged with stepping forward in those scenarios, it's causing people to have to be local heroes and step forward in their own light. But of course, there's not a lot to grab onto or keep that sustained or holding. So I mean, it's an interesting thought. One of the things that I remember picking up on last time I spoke about this chart was the square between Venus and the Moon. Now, the Moon in Aries Ingress charts indicates and signifies the people. Venus here ruling the sixth house in the sixth house indicates illness. But also, there's issues with labor as well, which I think we'll get into in just a moment. But I had hoped, looking at this, that there would have been more conversation about, in fact, a really deep conversation about the nature of the healthcare system in the U.S. It had seemed to me that this would have probably been about as good a window as any for that conversation to really come up. But I think because there's a square, the likely outcome of this is that the conversation is going to be hinging on the difficulties and pressures against the healthcare system without really coming in, because both of those planets are cadent and there's no angular planet that's connecting into this. Well, it doesn't really actually drive a meaningful change or shift in thinking. In fact, it probably seems like there will be a lot of patting on backs for the ability for hospitals to rally and come together, which I think is largely a machination of the media. You know, the hospitals are actually still incredibly stressed, especially, you know, I'm here in New York City, and it is not a pretty sight even still, although we are starting to see more people discharged than people coming in. So that's a positive thing. But the question is, you know, why should it have been necessary for private organizations and companies to have to step in the way that they did to build things? You know, there were two young enterprising individuals who had found a way to 3D print ventilator parts so that broken ventilators could be repaired. When the response from the company that was actually producing those ventilator parts and charging tens of thousands of dollars for them actually turned around and attempted to sue those two individuals. You know, I think it's a really interesting dynamic here, where it seems like the tension point, which should be causing us to question about the health of our system in a general sense, is getting totally overshadowed by the ability for people to find innovative solutions and endure. And I think that that message of endurance and finding a way to shoulder on and push through, that Venus and Taurus, the bull being that kind of symbol of endurance and labor, you know, to me is it's one of those things where I think it's a bit disappointing to see that this hasn't really kind of materialized in a different conversation on the national level. Now, earlier in this year, I mean, the UK chart has that Mars Jupiter conjunction, Mars Jupiter Pluto, right on the ascendant. I mean, extremely close. And at the time when I first looked at this chart, I was from the UK, living in the UK. And it seemed to me that that connection of those planets was going to have a pretty big impact on manufacturing jobs. And at the time, I was, you know, accumulating all these articles that had started to suggest economic indicators that started to suggest that there were problems with manufacturing jobs within the UK, but actually kind of it being a global issue within the West. I mean, and this isn't really, I mean, I'm being very general here because I don't want to lose anybody. We are trying to keep this astrological. But the point is, you know, when you think about, you know, Mars and Capricorn as a symbol of industry, you know, working with iron and steel in the earth, being able to move, it's hard for me to not see the huge impact that coronavirus has had on people who work in plants, work in facilities, and very often in very tight corners who had to completely shut down. But of course, this moon Venus square also points to people who work in industries where people's spending is actually part of the equation. You know, shops have had to close down, restaurants have essentially had to close down, event planning organizations have had to shutter up. And we're starting to see a lot of businesses kind of fold and move in some pretty difficult directions. Now, the question is, you know, where does this take us in the back half of the year? You know, where is the optimism here? Which I think is, you know, it's a big question and a big exploration that I think that we need to kind of explore. It's been noted in the chat, and this is something that I was going to bring up, that the 10th ruler, which is Mercury, is on the opposite side of the house. So, you know, if we take a look at the 10th, those in power, seeing that planet positioned in the 4th house, you know, this is it's an interesting symbol for, you know, the kind of confusion and lack of clear communication that we've been receiving from central government authorities as we move through this economic kind of crisis and this health crisis as well. But it's also connected, as Mark Cullen observed, to the 8th house. Mercury rules both the 8th and the 10th. So, you know, there's tough decisions here that have to be made by leadership. One of the discussion points that I made in the UK Aries Ingress conversation that Wendy and Roy expertly guided us through was that there is research now. You know, there's plenty of robust statistics that indicate that economic hardship, joblessness, economic insecurity increases deaths, and it does so in a very, very statistically reliable and devastating way. the horizon is a little bit different on this. We're looking at the deaths that come from economic insecurity. It could take up to 5 years before we start to actually see the manifestation of those deaths. It's a little bit on, but we have to recognize that with COVID, when we shut down the economy, what ends up happening is businesses have to close, and people eventually lose their jobs. People are living paycheck to paycheck, even if they've maintained their jobs. So many people now are furloughed. We have over 20 million people who are currently unemployed in the U.S. Okay, again, I think that's an interesting thing to see with that Mars-Jupiter conjunction with Pluto, and then the Moon-Venus square. So many people entering into unemployment. And when you shut down these kind of things, what ends up happening is we've got people now without access to healthcare. We've got increased stress. So essentially leadership now, and I think this is maybe not where Mark intended this conversation to go, but it was the point that I wanted to make. The combination of the 10th house and the 8th house here is an indication to me that leadership is going to have to make decisions about death that are really uncomfortable. And we're going to have to say yes to death in one avenue or another, whether that means, we say we need to start opening up the economy, recognizing this is going to result in hundreds of thousands of deaths through coronavirus, or we say, no, we're going to keep the economy closed, and we're going to be talking about the millions of deaths that actually happen over the next 5 years as, we start to see increasing pressure on individual well-being. And of course, there's the question too of length of life lost. If we keep the economy closed, that's going to save us some corona deaths. But the average is showing that, people are dying on average at age mid-70s, I believe, and with average lifespan at the upper 70s to 80, you're looking at somewhere between 4 to 5 years of life lost. Whereas with economic insecurity, you can be looking up to decades of life lost. So I mean, there's some pretty interesting, and I mean, I don't envy anybody who has to sit in a room and talk about these things and make decisions about the lives of hundreds of millions of people. But this is kind of the direction that we've got to go. And I think what's a little bit interesting is seeing that the 10th ruler is angular here. Both the 10th ruler and the 4th ruler are both in their sign of fall. Okay, and Mercury actually is the 10th ruler, is also in its sign of detriment. So if the 10th house represents those in power, the 4th house represents their opposition. And I think one of the interesting things to note here is that, as unsatisfied as right now, I think half the population is about 50%, which is maybe what you'd expect of the population's unhappy with the current administration's response to this outbreak. But it's angular, and it seems to me like there's an ability to actually grab onto power here, whereas the 4th ruler, which would be the opposition to the current administration, is cadent. That Jupiter is within 5 degrees of the cusp of the 3rd house. I would happily consider that a cadent Jupiter. And Jupiter is also in fall. So it seems to me, quite an interesting symbol when I step back and realize, where is the Democratic Party right now in terms of establishing leadership? And you might, argue that there's nothing that they could actually do. There's nothing Biden can do. It might make a lot of sense now as the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party for Biden to, kind of step back and be quiet, because there's not a whole lot that can be done. But is that going to come back to cause problems for him as we enter into election season, if election season even continues as we expect? Who knows? Now, Andre's made the comment in the group chat that human life should matter more than economics. And Andre, the point that I'm making is that there are models that are showing that keeping the economy closed will result in more deaths and more loss than opening the economy back up. And it's not just the United States that would be impacted, it's the entire world, especially, places that rely on the U.S. ability to import and buy, from countries that rely on exports. So actually, the impact of keeping the economy closed will result in more deaths and more years lost. So I think you actually can make the better case, I think, that if we don't turn the economy around, that wasn't the humane choice in the end. The humane choice would actually be able to figure a way to live through this and stop talking about, existing in a post-COVID world, but recognize we need to start being ready to live within a mid-COVID world where we're here right now participating. And we've got some questions here. It says, would you consider that the opposition, Jupiter and detriment, it's not the Democratic Party, but in fact the invisible enemy, the virus? And if that's not the case, if that's the case, it applies to Pluto. No, I wouldn't. I mean, I'm quite happy to say that if I'm going to use anything about illness, I would use the 6th, I'd use the 12th, and I'd use the 8th before I would jump to using the 4th. The 4th might signify death, but not the illness itself, or not an invisible enemy at the very least. One of the things that has been really interesting is the way that Mars has continually showed up with this virus. When the World Health Organization was notified of this virus, and then the World Health Organization in turn turned around to let the world know that this is a matter of international concern. Mars is at 27 degrees of Scorpio. And if you take a look back, here we go. Mars is at 24 degrees of Scorpio in the solar eclipse. That was just days before the World Health Organization was notified, okay? Just days. If we move here, the 24 degrees of Scorpio, again, is on the ascendant. And the 12th house cusp here, I think this illness, it goes past your common cold. I mean, to me, this is like a 12th house kind of illness, because it results in social isolation. It results in us having to be distant from each other. And it's also of the kind of severity that it's completely disrupting the world. So to me, the 12th feels quite appropriate, which is ruled by this Mars conjunct Jupiter, Jupiter signifying the 4th house here of the land and the environment. So to me, the connection here, I'd look to Mars just as soon as I'd look to anything else. And Mark says that the US is not becoming more united in the crisis, unlike many other countries. The UK political point scoring on both sides, as an example, the UK, which is becoming more united. And what he's saying is that there's political point scoring on both sides, a toxic political culture. And that's exactly right, Mark. I mean, this is the reality of what happens when you've got a two-party system, is you've got these two kind of fighting and arguing with each other. Are there any other comments here, Lee, that we should pick up? There's quite
Let's
a few.
go on to the next chart, because we're basically going to cover more than this, but this, I think we've pretty much covered what this overlay is.
Great, let's do it. Why don't you kick us off?
Well, a lot of people have probably never even looked at a Mars-Saturn conjunction, but the use of it goes back to at least to Alcabitius. What Alcabitius spelled out was that you don't look at a Mars-Jupiter or a Mars-Saturn in isolation. It's a cycle where you start the cycle at the Mars-Saturn conjunction in Cancer. Now, this gives you a hint as to what you're actually doing, because both Mars and Saturn, the two malefics, are in debility in Cancer. So what you're really looking at is which one is going to really plague you for this roughly 2-year period. And it's interesting because this view of life is basically assuming that either you're going to be dealing with such things as fires and fevers, or you're going to be dealing with famines and plagues. So it's, are you afflicted by hot, or are you afflicted by cold, basically? So this cycle that we're in right now goes back to 2004, which was the last of the Mars-Saturn conjunctions.
Do you remember? I have it in my system, but I was doing research on this maybe 2 or 3 years ago, but I've forgotten. Do you remember what degree that conjunction was?
I've got it on my system, I believe. Well, no, I don't want to believe. I want to look.
Okay, well, have a look, because we've got some interesting stuff happening in Cancer here. We've got the moon at 3, and one of those degrees, there's a good shot that it's close to one of those, and it
was 2004, and I'm just scanning through my system to find. That's the Aries Ingress. Okay. I'll get that while you're talking, Wade.
SJ says it was 11 degrees. So there we go. 11 degrees, which is right on the cusp of the 12th house here. Quite interesting. And
so,
more
importantly here, the sun is partile square it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which is the point. And so you see it fits into a pattern here. The thing about this particular chart is that what has been a marker, if you move this chart around the globe, the proximity of the Mars-Saturn conjunction to either an angle or to a significant degrees in country charts has definitely pointed out the areas that have had the highest mortality, or also, of course, Wuhan shows up because that was the first outbreak. But for example, that Mars-Saturn conjunction was pretty much right on the IC for Spain. It connected in with the Italy Kingdom chart. And so we can see that this particular chart, more than the other ones, I think, has really been showing the process of the virus and its impact. And I think this is especially appropriate because this is exactly how historically this kind of chart would have been used, is these are the things that will afflict you during this period of time. So in our case, it's showing up in the 6th house, which here it's not as angular as it's been in some of the other locations, but still, considering what it has been, that makes a lot of sense. And it also tends to be a bit grim as far as the outcome is concerned. The other thing that I think has been significant, I mentioned that in the Black Death chart, when Eschenden referred to what I refer to as the major conjunction. But the use of the term major was not just because it was a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. Major was when you had, in their parlance, all 3 of the superiors conjunct. And of course, Mars was the other of the thirds, the third superior. So here you have 2 of the superiors conjunct and the one, and the ones that can do some damage. So the fact that you've got, again, you have the Saturn rulership, but this shift into Aquarius is very important, I think. And this is important. We will end the year with a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction at 0 Aquarius. So the first thing that this has done is this has meant that we're not having to wait for the Jupiter-Saturn in December. We're basically already in the period. This becomes a harbinger of it because of that repetition. So this increases the magnitude of the effect. Now you can see you've got Jupiter ruling the 8th. It's conjunct Pluto in the 6th. This was very close, in fact, to the Jupiter-Pluto, degree-wise. And so, and it's when you have Jupiter here ruling the 6th, or ruling the 8th in the 6th, when you connect 6 and 8, what you begin to talk about is chronic disease, not just one-off disease.
Yeah.
And that's another piece of this, as far as how we're going to be working with this, is that this is not something that just you have it once, it goes away. And so all these ideas about, oh, well, it'll just stop, or maybe it'll stop in the summer. This is suggesting something that has more of a duration. And at the very least, it has a duration until the Jupiter-Saturn.
Right. I think what's interesting is, Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions are pretty interesting generational markers. And, it's not like I want to stop right now and speculate about the generation that's going to be born under that signature. But I do think that there are generational concerns, things that we care about and pay attention to over certain time frames. This is the first time that we're moving into conjunction in air signs consecutively in over 800 years. And I think we're going to have a lot of questions that we don't even know how to ask just yet. But what's interesting to me is that Mars and Saturn are meeting in the exact same degree that Jupiter and Saturn will meet later this year, but they're not doing it at the same time. It's almost like what this says to me is that different types of people will be moving toward this new solution at different speeds and at different paces. And it seems to me that, whereas Saturn is representing, for one, I could be wrong about this. There's something about Saturn and Aquarius that feels like the best delivery of Saturn, and it feels the right level of restraint, and it's almost I don't know how to put it's like I've got a picture in my head, but I don't know how to explain it. But it's this idea of boundaries being presented and limitations and things being presented in a way that actually open up doors rather than close them, and move into a completely different way of operating and existing. And to have Mars make it past this goalpost with Saturn first, and then for Jupiter to do it, it almost has this picture of like Papa Saturn, brings Mars, the eager one, in first, and then Jupiter's lagging behind, Saturn goes back into Capricorn, talks to the Jupiter type people and say, okay, it's time for you to come with me too. Bring your optimism, bring your hope. And let's go. So it seems to me, you know, the difference between Mars and the symbolism of the individuals who are pioneers for pioneers' sake, you know, and that's often the problem with Mars, you know, is sometimes just wanting to go, wanting to kick doors down, but there are people ready for the future, and Saturn's ready to get them started. And that's happening right here and right now. But there are people who maybe, I believe, are naturally, they are naturally optimistic, but take a look at the world that they were born into. You know, my generation, I saw this wonderful tweet recently that said, you know, my generation of millennials were born into a recession, have seen multiple wars, have seen, you know, indications that the election systems are completely defrauded, have seen plutocratic, you know, you've not lived in an environment that gives you any indication that anything is working. We haven't seen anything different. So as optimistic as you might be about life, and as much as you want to believe and feel like you can embrace the beauty in life, that, you know, you have been let down quite a bit. And so I think that there's a need to, the symbolism here of Mars coming first, that pioneer goes for it, but we need to remember that the optimism side of us needs to come to the table too. Otherwise, we let Mars go and create this new world on its own. And I don't know about you, but I would prefer Jupiter be part of the equation to offset a little bit of, you know, Mars's eagerness. But one of the things that I had not realized, and I think I need to spend some time interpreting and thinking about, is what it means for the first ruler of this chart, the Sun, to be in square to the root of this cycle. So for Saturn and Mars to have been at 11 degrees of Cancer at the beginning of this Saturn-Mars cycle, okay, to now find that the Sun, as we're updating this, moving into Aquarius, what does it mean that the Sun, as the ascendant ruler, the ruler of the people, is in square to that position? I don't know, and I think that probably is worth exploring. Yeah. Should we keep moving?
Yeah, let's, you know, just
Or do you have any
I'm
thoughts?
looking, I was just going to say, I'm looking at the chart. The chart for the root chart that we're talking about here was May 25th, 2004 at 1:39 a.m. for New York,
Yeah.
or excuse me, for Washington. That chart, you know, and in that chart, the Mars Saturn at 11 Cancer was in the fifth house. And you know, and it's a very interesting one when you tie it together with the other charts. So definitely the root chart is an interesting one.
Yeah, great. Okay, let's move forward. Oh, busy slide. Okay, so I just wanted to orient everybody. We've got 3 eclipses here, and they work in chronological order. So the upper left, then we've got the lower, and then the one on the right. And we're gonna have Lee kick us off here.
Okay, well, there's plenty to do.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, let's just spend a couple of minutes on this. All right, so what we have with the one in the upper left, let's okay, so we start with the lunar eclipse, and for those of you who aren't used to looking at this, remember the solar eclipse is at the conjunction, the lunar eclipse is at the opposition. So here you won't have a visible lunar eclipse because, of course, it's the moon that gets eclipsed, not the sun. So here we have it taking place in the 9th and the 3rd. You'll see it's suddenly we're not talking about Saturn. Imagine that's actually one of the differences here. Now, being in this age of, you know, being in this age of the plague, so to speak, what you can notice is the proximity of Mars and Neptune to the 6th house cusp. So the first thing this tells me, looking at that, is it's not over with yet. Now, obviously, there's been a lot of discussion about how to phase this into more people going back to work in various industries. How safe is it? What kind of a pathway can you do with this? Several things we can look at this. First of all, you know, it pays to say, well, you know, is there even something people are dealing with? Okay, here at any point, the answer is yes. So how can we phase? What can we do? Having the Jupiter-Pluto going on in the 4th house certainly represents a level of danger to the country, to the land. Having Uranus at the 8th house cusp suggests that we're going to see some mortality spikes. I mean, that's pretty much a given here. Venus in this chart is much less dignified than it was in the charts we were looking at with the Aries Ingress and so on, because we have Venus in Gemini, which is not one of her favorite signs, and she's retrograde. And this has certain similarities to 2018, where you had Mars retrograde and Venus retrograde in the same year. Generally speaking, Venus retrograde is like awful for retail business. Um, you think about this as a customer process. We have Venus in a sign she doesn't like, going, well, I'm not sure if I like this or if I like that. And so if that's your general characteristic, now you've got that taking place with that Venus conjunct the Sun combust retrograde. So it's the inferior conjunction opposite the moon, of course, because we're at a lunar eclipse. And in the ninth house, cadent. And so this suggests to me a lower level of retail activity. So things are still not in any way here normal.
I think you're right. And can I just jump in to
Yeah.
say, because I've paid, obviously, my career, having worked in retail for a long time, paid attention to this. I completely agree. And I think what it is it tends to be a race to the bottom in times when Venus is in Gemini. In general, I think Venus and Gemini can be a really tough thing for retailers. I think retrograde is going to make it even more tough, because what ends up happening is consumers end up being much more mercurial in their shopping, which means they're looking for quick discounts, savings, and retailers end up at a race for the bottom to see who can cut prices fastest, which is it's usually not something that you quite prepare for, because it's not, although Venus will be in Gemini around the same time. I mean, I'm focusing on, Venus and Gemini, which is not quite what you were talking about, Lee, but or maybe it is. But it'll be in Gemini around the same time that the Sun is near Gemini. But that could be a month before, a month after. It can retrograde back in or go in early and then come back. So it's a little bit tough to plan for. But this has always been a really tough season, because there's a lot of desire to purchase, but there's also competition, extreme amount of competition, and it's an interesting time to watch, and it's always been a bit of a soft time in my mind.
Yes, and I've noticed that as well. I've been doing some consulting with an industry that has been trying for the last 2 months to figure out how to get back in, and the people at the top were wanting to get started, and put their push just as Mercury was going, or as Venus was going retrograde. I'm going, no, this is not going to work.
Right. There's a
No.
question here. If there's, what do we think about Venus combust, and for how long? Does that have a real impact on business? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I would say the two factors of Venus being in Gemini and retrograde are more significant. But the combustion doesn't help either. It's like your story is getting lost. And here, of course, it's getting lost because there's trumpeting everything else going on. But that can be a factor as well. So every way you look at it, Venus is not doing well. Now, if you look at the next eclipse, the one at the bottom of the page here,
Mm.
you'll see we still have Venus retrograde. And of course, this is only a couple of weeks later. Now, that's much closer to the station point. And as you can see now, it's not combust as well. It's associated, it's basically hanging out of the second house cusp. So there's still a hesitation, but I think it's not as strong as the hesitation that's showing up in the earlier June one for this solar eclipse. Now, the solar eclipse is really taking place at the third house cusp, given the 5-degree rule, more than it is in the second, which brings it to the point that this again is a cadent eclipse. What we're probably seeing here, with the Uranus conjunct the ascendant, with Pluto conjunct the midheaven, with Jupiter right there, you've got this sense at the top that coming through the president, coming through the executive branch, is going to be almost an imposition that we are going to be taking action by now, because you can see a strong statement coming. But are people listening? Are people actually responding to this? Well, you can see Mars sextile that in the 12th, not always the best location as far as getting anything done. As far as the economy is concerned, what we're now seeing is you got Mercury that's ruling the second house. Mercury and Jupiter or excuse me, Mercury and Venus are in a kind of a mutual reception because Venus has triplicity in Cancer. It's not a strong one. It's kind of a minor reception. It may help a little bit, but you know the Mercury retrograde now ruling the second isn't indicating to me like suddenly we're having a robust recovery.
Yeah, and if I can just make a quick addition to this, I would actually expect a lot of market fluctuation around this time anyway. If
Yes.
you, one of the things that Wendy mentioned that I actually didn't know, I'd never pieced this together, but I'll share it for those who are here and maybe didn't realize. You know, Washington and New York, this part, I mean, we know, but Washington and New York are very close together in on a map. You know, it's but if you draw a map for Washington D.C. or for New York, and then you were to cut that all the way through the other end of the globe, what you're going to find is you're going to get that line runs through Beijing. And it runs very close to Shanghai as well. And anytime that you've got something on the midheaven or IC in the US, when it's based in Washington or New York, you're going to have that same thing on the opposite angle in China. So that connection of Pluto, Jupiter, Saturn, that's all going to be on the IC in China. And I think there's going to be an escalation in trade war issues and difficulties there as a result of that connection.
Yeah. So now we can specifically look, what does the sixth house look like for, you know, the health and disease situations of the country? There's that Mercury again. This doesn't look like an improved situation,
Especially
except
not in a
perhaps,
water sign, right? I mean,
yeah, it's in a water sign now. Maybe the level of infection is a little lower than was being suggested by the Mars Neptune. So it might be a marginal improvement, but this is not like, oh, wow, we're so healthy right now.
right, right.
We go on another 2 weeks, and now we're at, you know, Happy Birthday America. Um, and so now we have Mars in Aries looking really strong. And this was one of the points of this year, is that here we get into Mars in Aries, one of the two domicile signs for Mars. And yet what is kind of lurking in the background of this is no matter how strong this Mars is, it is going to go retrograde. And this is taking place within the orb of the square to your eclipse. And so I think this is an eclipse where I think, you know, much as, you know, everybody's been looking at these charts and seeing the level of toxic politics. Well, we ain't seen nothing yet, because now I think the politics is going to be starting to get much more overtly brutal with this eclipse occurring in the 10th and the 4th. You've got Mercury square Mars. I mean, we're everything in the, you know, everything that gets said now is one variation of fake news or another. That certainly doesn't suggest any of that is going to be going away. So, and you've got the sun in Cancer, ruling the sixth house at this point in the 4th. So with that association, several of the people on the board were mentioning it as well, with the association of the 4th house with the grave, I don't think we're done with deaths yet. So, and now the 11th house in mundane, among other things, involves Congress. And so you see now the grouping of the mess has moved on to Congress. So wait, any other thoughts? Have we lost Wade?
Sorry, I was muted. I'm
Oh,
here. I was saying that
I was
I don't.
afraid I wasn't hearing everything you were saying.
No, I was just saying that I don't have anything to add in particular that I haven't already said. I think
Yeah.
with the eclipses, I looked at 2019. I didn't look at these so much. I mean, I think the Mars retrograde is really interesting, but I don't really. I think S.J. Anderson did a fantastic job in his conversation about China, talking about the Mars retrograde, and Rob Bailey also discussed it in the Australia. Aries Ingress conversation. So I'd rather direct people to what was said there. I think let's go ahead and jump into Jupiter Pluto, because I think this is where things are going to get a bit interesting.
Well, the first thing that you have to realize, if you go back to the Harvey Bajan Campion book on mundane astrology, where they talked about the cycles of the outer planets, when you're looking at Jupiter Uranus, Jupiter Neptune, Jupiter Pluto, One of the first things is you're looking at cycles that are essentially around 13, 14 years in length. So, and it's important to know when you're looking at these cycles what you're looking at, because when I said that the Mars-Saturn cycle was really kind of the natural one to look at plagues, you now have to think about, okay, well, what's running on that kind of a 12 to 14 level that you're not already covering in the Jupiter cycle itself. So, so this is one of the things. When I look back historically with the Jupiter Pluto, I kind of have the fuzziest vision. And I've had that same reaction to the Jupiter Neptune and the Jupiter Uranus as well. I don't think they are the strongest cycles as far as showing things, but that doesn't mean we can't look at them and not look for some insights, at least in the periods in which they fall.
You know,
So,
it seems to me if Saturn Pluto, really kicked this off, Jupiter Pluto's got a possibility of helping heal some of it, or at least moving us to a position of
yeah,
acceptance that this is the world that we're in. I think what's really interesting is that 24-degree Scorpio shows up again. If you're basing this on the US, we're not done with this conversation. And then Mars will actually station at 28 degrees of Aries and turn retrograde. So that connection to the US chart is quite fascinating. And then it seems to me as we move to November, this final bit, a couple points to make. I mean, the first thing is it seems to me that this is very likely to be a period where we start to see throughout all of this, I think we're going to continue to see tons of outbursts of, small pockets. I think we're probably going to have a decent handle on how to heal from this by the time we get to November. I think that's what that Jupiter-Pluto is about, although I think we still have, while Pluto is moving through the remainder of Capricorn until it makes an ingress into Aquarius, there will be deaths and impacts that we haven't quite assimilated through economic hardship, and I think that's going to take the rest of the Pluto cycle through Capricorn to make sense of. But the other thing is that this connection of 12 November 2020, this is again the just a week after the election. It's very, very soon, a couple days after the election, in fact. And when I take a look at this and think about that, this is, Arthur said it, this is just before, Mars goes direct again. There's a square from Mars to these planets. We're going to continue to see those re-hit with the square. But that 22 degrees is what I was saying before. That 22 degrees is the same degree that we had the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction in Taurus in 2000, and it's in trine to Trump's midheaven. And I think that there's probably a need for us to explore. And Wendy's saying, can we see a chart for the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction? All three of these are Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions. We have the first pass here, the second pass, and the third pass. Because what happens is there's a retrograde cycle, and then we move forward. But anyway, I need to do a little bit of work around this, before I take a predictive stance as to what I expect to happen around the election. But this is, kind of an interesting thing to me, because I think that there's going to be a lot of credit flying around for a lot of things that actually have little to do with the people who I get credit for them in terms of how we are responding to the crisis that we're facing over the next few months. I don't know if you got any other thoughts on that, Lee.
no, I think what we do know, as I said, is it's about a 12 to 14 year cycle.
Right.
But the cycle that historically has been the most involved with the question of regime change is, I think, our next example, which is the Jupiter-Saturn itself.
Yeah. Okay, let's go ahead and move into Jupiter-Saturn conjunction 2020. What do you think, Lee?
Well, the first thing is that we are not in the beginning of the age of air. We're in what is the end of what Richard Edlin in the 17th century called the retrogression of the conjunction. And so let me talk a little bit about this, because it's extremely important in understanding this process that's involved. Whenever you have the first Jupiter-Saturn conjunction into a new element, it's called a mutation. And what happens almost invariably is either the next conjunction or the one after it goes back into the previous element of the mutation cycle, which runs from fire to earth to air to water, and then back to fire. So that reversal, that change back to the old element, is called a retrogression, the conjunction. The term was not used by the Arabs, but it was picked up later. You have a perfect example of this during William Lilly's lifetime, because in 1603, you had the Great Mutation into Fire, and this was basically the death of Elizabeth the First, and then the ascension of the Stuart dynasty.
Yeah.
And so you moved into fire, the next one was in fire, and then the next one was back in water. And this is the period where you had where Charles the First pissed off Parliament, and Parliament was pissed off with Charles, and they fought, and eventually he was beheaded. And they had a period without a king, and then they went back right at the next conjunction into fire. What the sense of this process is that when you get the first conjunction in a new element, which for us was 1980, a number of the issues of the new element come forward, and basically it starts. But with that retrogression, you get the reassertion of the power that was under the old element. And a lot of the people who are partisans of the old way think they've won. And it takes the next conjunction to realize, as in this case, that air has won, and we're now fully in the air period. So this isn't just a standalone conjunction chart. It's part of the end of this process of the assertion of the air of the air element. So the fact that it's taking place in the U.S. square and ascendant at 0 Taurus is basically just highlighting this whole process of which this is.
Yeah.
It's the whole tension of the conversion from one system to another.
Well, there's a lot of tension in this chart too, isn't there? I mean, there's the Saturn Jupiter is in an exact square to the ascendant. Mars is in an exact square to that Pluto. You know, I mean, those are some pretty tight, and the moon is moving to a near exact square of the sun and Mercury.
Mm-hmm. This is a very tension-filled chart. And, you know, basically, when you think about it, the qualities of earth are cold and dry. The qualities of air are hot and wet. They have nothing in common with them. And these two changes from water to fire and earth to air are definitely the tough mutational changes.
Yeah.
It's just a huge amount to assimilate. And this chart looks exactly like that, the level of conflict that implies. So as we've said, and you see now, that Mars, Saturn that we had March 31st is right in line with this Jupiter-Saturn. So what we basically have is the introduction of many of the issues. When you think about the general qualities of air versus the qualities of earth, among the things that you can talk about as far as shifts, air moves, earth doesn't like to. And just starting there and starting to iterate the ways that that's true, begin to give you an insight into the level of change that we're dealing with. This is not, now, as far as what we've seen, we've only had 2 political elections within the US where there's been a change of element in the Jupiter-Saturn, and that's the 1980 and the 2000, because of this retrogression issue. In both of those cases, the party in power changed. Now, 2 is not a large statistical base, so I certainly wouldn't do any predictions on that alone, but there is a sense here that you're not talking about a trivial regime change, you're talking about a bigger regime change. So that's one of the things that's built in, but you're looking at it with fixed signs on the ascendant and descendant. There's going to be a lot of pressure and drag on that process occurring. So yeah, it's a tremendously stress-filled chart. So Wade, do you want to pick up from there?
Realize I had myself muted again. My apologies. My dogs are running around the house. I'm just trying to make sure that that doesn't get picked up as much as possible. Well, I think I think a lot of probably what I would have wanted to say has been said already. I think it's just really difficult to imagine the way that we're going to be required to shift and to change to operate in the new environment. And of course, this Saturn-Jupiter conjunction is happening within larger cycles than itself. So, we have Saturn-Neptune cycle that's going on, Saturn-Uranus, and of course we spent a lot of time with Saturn-Pluto. I think for now, this is, to me, because the focus of this conversation today is going to be on the 2020 Aries Ingress. So for now, I think I'll leave it there, but I will just say that what's contained here is it's almost a magnet that, we're sitting here now, it's April, this takes place in December, and we can feel the ways that we're being drawn into this symbolism already, this kind of juxtaposition between, easy paths and difficult paths and how to choose between them. And I think it's going to be a continued exploration. So hoping to pick up the 2020 Saturn-Jupiter conjunction in the future at another time. But why don't we end on hopefully, a little bit of a different note, just to give some kind of, and Marcus said it would be interesting to take a look at the China-Jupiter-Saturn conjunction too, maybe next time. Yeah, great idea, Mark. So we'll go ahead and jump into the 21 Aries Ingress, not to fully delineate it, but maybe just to give us something to look forward to. So we have Aquarius rising here, very rare. I mean, what do you think about that, Lee? We don't really have Aquarius rising in the Northern Hemisphere very much.
Well, I mean, if you can, it's just we're talking about the relative speeds. I mean, certainly the issue here is that when you look at a chart, we've got Jupiter at the ascendant. You've got the sun near and in exaltation, ruling the second house. You've got that Jupiter, which has participating triplicity in the air signs, ruling the 10th. You've got a much more hopeful looking chart. Now, the ancients generally did not like the moon in Gemini. That was considered an affliction of the moon, actually on a par with the moon being void of course. So that, looking at that from a mundane standpoint, it is square Neptune. My goodness, there might be some fraud going on. There might be some nefarious activities. Imagine, it's so rare.
I mean, this is, Bernie Madoff also had that Jupiter,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely putting some cautions up on that. But as far as looking grim, this doesn't have the grim sense of many of the charts we've looked at for 2020. Now, this is not to say, have we completely recovered economically from 2020? Of course we haven't. But there's a sense here that there's some optimism. There are some changes going on. You've got the sun is the exaltation ruler of Aries. Its proximity to the second makes me think it's probably going to end up being more of a ruler than Mars, but the Mars influence here in Gemini, not a strong sign for Mars. But what it suggests also is more a segmented economy, as far as certain sections probably having pretty much completely recovered, other sections not.
I think that's right. I mean, with Saturn and Venus and the Sun all dignified, and then we've got an angular Jupiter making the best of what it's got, but then we've got some debilitated planets too. It seems to me that we're going to see some uneven shakeout.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and of course Mars angular here in the fourth house is, that's something to take into consideration. That Mercury Mars square. I think there's still going to be a lot of finger pointing and blaming about exactly what did and didn't happen, but it's nice to see a chart where we've got the potential to make something peaceful out of the year. We don't have to necessarily power through conflict only all year long. So there's some things about this chart that are quite hopeful. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Lee, do you have anything you want to advertise for us?
Well, we should, of course, both advertise the fact that we have ongoing courses with the School of Traditional Astrology and Horary.
We sure do. I'll put a link to that site in the chat box.
Right. The next one is starting this summer in August, and I have the STA medical course, which will be starting in October.
Okay.
We should soon be setting up, I would think, the schedules for the 2021 courses.
I believe so, because I think we're almost booked on the August course. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's good booking in the medical course, but there is still room at the moment. So those are two of the big things. I'm hoping that those of you who are members of the AA will be seeing some material of mine soon showing up there. And I'll be putting out probably 2 or 3 more articles on this material on my blog, which you can get to from my website, which will be up as soon as Wade changes the screen.
Yeah, sorry. How do I put it up? Do I just do?
It's Lee at leelehman.com, or the site is leelehman.com, and you can just go there.
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll just very quickly showcase.
I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, there you go. So here's what we've got, leelehman.com. And it's got all the info that you need to be able to get in touch with Lee. But that's it for us. So just want to say thank you to everybody. Lee, again, thank you so much for your expertise. You're a wizard. We all knew that. You know, you did played some pretty great bits of information on us, lots for us to think about. So thanks everybody for attending, and hope you all stay safe and have a wonderful weekend.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.